Now I'm going to start with two of my personal favorite types of fiction, which are fantasy fiction and science fiction. Now, fantasy fiction, if you have ever found yourself very interested in movies or books that deal with magic, then you are probably reading fantasy fiction. It can also take place in, special worlds and have a very unique different types and species of characters. You might deal with fairies, you might deal with warlocks, you might deal with creatures with wings, animals, talking animals. And so there's a lot of elements inside of fantasy fiction that are not real. Neil Gaiman books, a lot of them fit into fantasy fiction. And Harry Potter would be fantasy. They use the magic, they go to that fantasy school. And it's just kind of something to let you escape into a world that's, feels a bit more magical, feels a bit more special. Now, science fiction is when science kind of takes the place of magic. But to us now today, it can seem pretty magical. So science and technology that we don't have right now. So we don't have it, but they do. Now, this can take place in the future. This can take place in space. This can take place on other planets that are a lot like our own. So, those are my personal two favorites. I don't know what types of stories you prefer, but if you haven't given science fiction and fantasy a try, I highly recommend it. And here, again, I know the quality is not great, but we are going to make do. So here is what is called a Venn diagram that I am making on fantasy fiction and science fiction. So whenever you have a Venn diagram like this is showing that somebody wants you to compare and contrast two things. So when we compare, we are showing how both things are similar. How are they alike? What do they have in common? And then when we contrast, because these are two different genres, there are going to be a lot of differences, but so when we contrast, we show the differences. So on this side of my Venn diagram, I'm going to put the traits that are unique to science fiction here, the ones that are unique to fantasy here, and the ones that kind of overlap a little bit and have in common here, because they are my two favorite genres for a reason. And so they have, different types of unique characters. So while fantasy fiction might have fairies and elves and all the types of things that you would see on Lord of the Rings or Dobby the house elf, the different types of characters that you would see in science fiction are usually more like aliens, which are pretty cool because when you go into aliens, you are limited only by your imagination. Check out Star Trek sometime, or if you're bored and you put in an old Star Wars video, pause at, when they visit different planets at their cantinas or like their restaurants or town places, and just take a look at how many different unique species are in the background. So, the other thing that they have in common are things that can feel, we'll say, magical to us. So science fiction, it's not magic, but it is very advanced technology that we do not have access to. And if somebody were to show up in our times showing that type of technology, it would certainly look and feel like magic to us. And so fantasy has the actual magic. So that's our first two genres. And how they are different. Let's see. Fantasy can a lot of times take place in areas that feel a lot more like the past. Now, it's not necessarily the past, because I know Game of Thrones, people frequently wanted to compare it to the past, but the past on Earth We don't have their extreme seasons. We don't have dragons. We did have dinosaurs, but even though it was a totally different world, they do oftentimes make fantasy books feel like it takes place in the past. And whereas science fiction will take place in the future. So if you ever read a story that takes place 9,000 years from now, there's a good chance you are reading science fiction. If I'm going over some information that might be a little basic for you and you want to see what's ahead, I do make sure to label it so you could see it. And also, you might want to put it on 1.25 speed. But the good thing about videos is if you don't understand something I'm saying, you can keep going back. But hopefully I'm being helpful. So in this type of fiction, it is called realistic fiction. Here are some keywords that you would need to know for any type of literature ever. So if you don't know these, you don't remember these, you don't have access to your notebook where you wrote them before, just pause the lesson and jot them out now. So in realistic fiction, we have, like any other type of fiction, our setting. Setting means time and place. Time and place. We have our characters, which in realistic fiction are going to be people, but in other types of fiction, your characters could be animals, your characters could be objects. They're anyone who actively take part in the story, or interact or react or have a name, a personality. So if you have a story about a rock and that rock has a personality and makes some choices, it is a character. But for realistic fiction, it's just people. And then you have the conflict. Conflict is just the fancy word that you will see all the time for the problem. So despite maybe some random exceptions, all stories have these things: setting, characters, and problem. In realistic fiction, the place of the story is going to be a place that exists in the real world. Realistic. So this might take place at a middle school, and the characters are going to be realistic people. So here we have Layla, James, and Duke. They're the characters of our made-up story. And then you are going to have a realistic problem. Anytime you are reading a novel about average people in an average place in an average life, and maybe they're struggling with the problems of love, maybe fitting in, maybe gossip, maybe drama, it doesn't matter. As long as the problem is realistic, you are probably reading realistic fiction. So in this story, Layla and James, our characters are as happy as can be. But then we have Duke, and Duke has a conflict. Duke is sad. Duke is new to the school and doesn't fit in. And we just pull that out of his dialogue, which means the words he says. So Duke says, "How can I fit in? I hate being new." So we take that, and now we can piece together that Duke is a new student, and Duke's conflict that he has to fix by the end of the story is that he doesn't fit in. He's the new kid, and he's really bummed out. So that's the major branch of realistic fiction. But there are also different types of stories, short stories, novels, that fit in to the idea of realistic fiction. They're still their own genre, but they are also realistic as well. So, for instance, the first main one is historical fiction. So, historical fiction takes place in a real point in history. That's important. And that's also where historical fiction can get a little bit confusing. So historical fiction takes place in a real point in history. However, the story that the author makes up inside that real point of history is the fake part. So we have possibly fake characters. They could be real, but our fake characters are in a real point in history. So the example that I like to give is Titanic. And I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Titanic. It's a bit older, but it seems to be a classic. So the Titanic was called the unsinkable ship. And I'm not a history teacher, so my apologies for the parts that I get wrong. But it was the largest ship of its time, and it was super fancy, and inevitably, as we know, that ship was going to get hit was going to run into a giant iceberg in the middle of the night because they couldn't see. So the real part of this story in the movie Titanic was that the Titanic was a real ship. The Titanic actually existed. People actually got on the Titanic, and the Titanic actually hit an iceberg. And the Titanic actually broke and sank to the bottom. The Titanic also actually had very, very few safety boats so that people could use them to escape. And they had very few life vests and very few of the things that a ship should need. So, as you would see in the movie, is my understanding that the Titanic actually would kind of lock the poor people down on the bottom where they were. This could have been the workers, this could have been poor travelers, this could be whatever. So that the rich people could get out into a ship and be rescued. It's a very terrible thing, and we learned a lot since that moment. So a lot of things that you see in the background of this movie are true. In the movie, you even see some violinists who are like, well, we're not going to escape. So they sat out there on this super rich place with the super rich people, and they played their very beautiful artistic violins, and they played beautiful music as the ship sank and people sank to their death. So that is the stuff that I believe are the realistic part of historical fiction. Now, in this movie, though, the author made up two fake characters, Jack and Rose. And so there you have a love story with two heartthrobs that takes place in the Titanic. And I won't spoil what happens to their relationship, but, you know, if you've seen it, you know. So the point being that this whole love story between Jack and Rose, all those things that happened with Jack and Rose, those are all fake. That is a fake story told within the real point in history of the Titanic. So, again, with always, at any point, if you have questions, ask in the bottom. If you need help with specific questions, ask in the bottom. And the last part of realistic fiction that I'll go over for this is the adventure story. And a lot of you might already know if you like adventure stories. It depends on if those are the types of movies you go to see. So, an adventure story just tells about some extreme adventure undertaking, some big activity that takes place throughout the story that could be exciting, risky, or dangerous. And one of the more common adventure stories that I can think about at your level is called My Side of the Mountain. And in My Side of the Mountain, our young hero runs away from home. He lives in New Jersey, and he has, their grandpa has a farm somewhere that's all run down in the Smoky Mountains. So this young man, before cell phones and computers, runs away, and he decides to live on this old abandoned farm. The farm is gone, and so this young man survives by hunting, fishing, collecting water, hollowing out a gigantic tree and living inside of the tree. And you just experience all the different things that he goes through day to day. He goes to the library, learns what plants to eat, all that stuff. And that is called an adventure story. But it can take place, you know, in other ways as well. But that's your example. So I hope these help with some of your homework that you might have. Let me know if it doesn't.